stop ringing and nobody's in the line. So move along, Willie, just don't move too slow. 'Cause there won't be nobody there to open the door to let you in. You can't be too late. You've been wasting time. Don't ever waste a line. You gotta be on time if you wanna get in. Move along.
Good morning and welcome to WNHH-FM's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. We will visit today on the program with two different sets of guests who make our world tick in different ways. Later in this hour, we will chat with some of the movers behind Imani, a Yale School of Medicine psychiatric department program that works with churches in Connecticut cities to do outreach to people with substance abuse problems, adding the faith-based layer to trying to get a handle on the drug problem that is devastating our communities. And boy, they're doing a great job on it already, getting a lot of recognition, and have some interesting ideas they can share that go beyond the work they do to what we do as a society. But first up, in a moment, we're going to have on the phone a new voice from whom we're going to be hearing and reading much for years to come. Her name is Meng Jin. Her new book, officially hitting bookstores today, January 14th, is called Little Gods. It's a great read and has much to tell us about time, identity, the search for meaning, and it's just a great story in and of itself. So thanks for tuning in, and thanks to Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. So let me tell you, I read Little Gods. I liked it a lot. And while we're waiting for Meng Jin to call in, let me give you a sense of the plot. It's a coming of age story and a multi-generational story about two people at once. We follow two women as they come of age and search for their identities, and the story gets told simultaneously back and forth, and it's a Chinese and a Chinese American, or actually Chinese born woman. So it's about a rural woman named Sulan who becomes a brilliant physicist in China. Then she has her life and dreams mysteriously fall apart in the United States. We go back and forth with her story, trying to figure out what happened, and her 17-year-old daughter Leah's search for answers after the mother's unexpected death. So what happened? Where does she fit in? And by the way, who are these men from her, who kind of pop in, these two men from Sulan's past, and we're trying to figure out who she is. So now we do have on the phone Meng Jin. Meng Jin, thank you so much for calling into Dateline New Haven.
Thank you so much for having me.
I don't know if you just heard the summary I gave, that I called it two simultaneous coming-of-age and multi-generational stories about Sulan, the rural woman who becomes a brilliant physicist in China, then has her life and dreams mysteriously fall apart in the U.S., and her 17-year-old daughter Leah's search for answers after her mother's unexpected death. Fair way to summarize it? This whole book you put years into and hundreds of pages?
Well, that's always a challenge. But yeah, I think that's a great summary. Thank you.
And fair to say, and I think it's terrific, by the way. I read it over the break of the new year, really, really got caught up in it. And because, as always, what the plot is matters. Because a good story has to have people you care about and something happen to them, right? But you're really writing about a lot more when you do a novel. That's what I'm going to be asking you about.
Yeah, I mean, I see plot as a vehicle, right? A vehicle through which to tell a story and through which to explore moments of consciousness that I'm interested in.
And the pretentious word we
Yeah.
like to use is literary fiction, which means not a trashy book, but a good book that goes larger. And obviously, yours fits in that category. And what it really means is, I think, books that tell a story you care about. You want to know what happens and who's in it, but it's making you think about a lot broader stuff. And while your story, your book clearly has a lot to say about what it is to come from China or to be the daughter of Chinese immigrants right now and
Yeah.
search for who you are. Obviously, what makes it a successful book, too, and why I think there's going to be a big book, is because people from all walks of life can read it. And while being interested in the experience you're describing, can tap into our own feelings about who we are, where do we come from,
Oh,
and how do we wrestle with the
yeah.
past.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's definitely my hope. When I wrote the book, I really wanted it to be engaging, from the first page. I wanted it to feel propulsive, like there's this engine running under it. And sometimes that happens in terms of plot, but for me, I really think about language and rhythm and the way the sentences feel to me if they're pulling me along. Yeah, so thank
And
you
my
for
guess is
that
that when you did
description.
that, so a lot of stories are going on, trying to figure out what happened to this rural woman. How did she get to the big city and become a famous scientist trying to crack one of the big questions about time and math and science? And yet she died in America. We don't know what happened with that, and what happened with the father of the girl we're reading about in Tiananmen Square during the protest there. And did you do a lot of rewrites of the chapters to try to sort of, did you find yourself weeding out a lot of other stuff you're writing to keep the story moving, to keep us focused on wondering what happens next, and to keep the action moving?
Oh yeah, definitely. I rewrote this book I don't even know how many times. Yeah, and each time I actually sort of scratch. I like to do my revisions on a blank page so that,
Hmm.
I don't feel beholden to the old draft. And
Oh,
each
that's interesting.
time, hmm?
That's interesting.
Sorry.
That's very
Oh
interesting. A
yeah.
separate page, yeah. And
Yeah, no, I think that I like to do that because, at the end of each draft I know what it is that's the story I want to tell better, right? And I had an old writing professor who used to say that the timing of release of information was very important. So
like when we find out, you
each
mean when we find out which part of the story at what time? Like when we find out the two,
yeah, that was
you know,
Yeah, that was one of the big challenges of this book because there's so much information the reader needs to get, right? But you can't dump it all at once,
right.
or it's just gonna feel like an information dump. And how do you release the bits of information so that it feels like you're telling a story that you're pulling the reader in. And each time I got to the end of the draft because I had a better sense of what the story was, it was easier and more intuitive to figure out the best way to release the information.
Now, other fiction writers say that they start living with these characters. These characters are real in
Mm,
their mind, they're real people. And obviously, that's essential because I always thought it's harder to write fiction than nonfiction because within our suspension of disbelief, we have to believe, you're creating something that didn't really happen, but you have to make us
yeah.
believe it happened. Even if you have something magical in a story, like novels that have it in another time zone or people who have four legs, once you accept that premise, we have to believe
Hmm.
everything else is real and it happened. And I think that's a harder job. So people say they live with the characters, and sometimes while you're writing a novel, it takes a new turn while you're writing it because the characters have a life of their own and the story takes a root of its own. Did you have this all mapped out about this girl's search for the answers of her mother's death and the earlier story of the two men who competed for her affections in China? Or did this story take a life of its own, Meng Jin, and did you change part of its trajectory or some of the details as you went along?
Yeah, definitely the latter. All I really started with was the opening scene, right? The idea of a child being born on the night of June 4th, 1989, in Beijing, and her father disappearing. And I, you know, had no idea what happened.
Oh, that's
Um,
fun.
I just, yeah. So a lot of the early drafts was me trying to figure out what happened, and then after I figured out what happened, I had to figure out how to tell it. Um, Yeah, so the characters definitely surprised me a ton. I also didn't know very much about Sulan. Um, Probably for the first 3 years that I was writing this book, I had
Wow.
no idea about Yongzong, the character of Yongzong. And I actually started writing his section as almost research into my imagination, um, like like a thought experiment. And after I started writing his section, um, that was when I was like, oh, I can't actually just keep this as a thought experiment. I should put it in the book.
And how many years did you
Yeah,
spend writing this?
something like 6 or 7 years,
Wow.
a
All right.
very long time.
Well, the result is called Little Gods. It comes out today. William Morrow, Custom House print. It's a first
Yeah.
novel by Meng, who's visiting with us on Dateline New Haven at WNHH. You're home for community radio at 103.5 FM, live streamed at newhavenindependent.org. So you were working on this 6, 7 years, and
Yes.
one of the two main characters, the daughter, is born in the first scene. And she's born right when China is having its most important public protest that the whole world is watching in Tiananmen
Yeah.
Square in Beijing in 1989. And you were born then too, right?
I was not born on the same date, but I was born in the spring of 1989. Yes.
So, and we'll get to that about your person. But first, I want to say that even though you've been working on this for years, and this was fully much your story, the book gets released in a context when the world is thinking about kinds of literature. So your book was released at a time when we're reading a lot of very interesting novels about China and people who are born in China become Chinese American, and about immigrants. Two separate. I don't want to make that all one category. But like just when I read your
Right.
book, the very next book I read was The 10th Muse by Catherine Chung.
Mm.
And while it's a very
Oh,
different kind of book,
I just read that book. It's a wonderful book.
and even though there are similarities, it's about a daughter returning to China for clues about her family history, right? And it's about a math science brilliant woman who's
Yeah, well, in
chasing
Catherine
big
Chung's book,
ideas.
she returns to Germany,
Oh,
actually.
that's right, Germany, right. Sorry about that. But she's
But
looking.
yes, there is. It was one of those books that I read after I finished writing my book, and I was like, oh wow, it's almost spooky how many
And it's a very
similarities there
different
are.
book. I mean, the whole vibe and the way the
Yeah.
story's told. But that's similar. And also The Leavers by Lisa Ko, which I read recently, where a boy goes back to
Yeah.
China to understand his past and where he fits in. Again, different kinds of people. But it seems like there's an interesting, do you feel like there's an emergence of a kind of Chinese and Chinese American diaspora literature occurring that you're fitting into? Do you see this as something happening? Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. I think that the first generation, the earlier sort of Asian American stories that we had access to that were available to us were really wonderful. But these books are definitely taking the stories further and trying to push the boundaries of what the immigrant novel can do. That's definitely what I was trying to do with this book. I think a lot of immigrant novels focus on, stories of assimilation, of overcoming obstacles of assimilation, on, what it feels like, how hard it is to become an American after the immigrant arrives in the new land. And the novels that you just brought up, including mine, I think have more of this gaze towards the past and towards the first life, right? And I think that for me, that was a really important perspective to explore, because I felt that, that story of assimilation sometimes can assume that the immigrant doesn't exist until the moment of arrival, right?
Yeah.
And it was really important for me to tell Sulan's story and explore the richness and fullness of her life in China before she became an immigrant, because I think, as obvious, sometimes we can forget that people who immigrated to the U.S. Have these full lives that they are leaving behind, that they were 180% full people. Yeah.
That's so
That
interesting to me what you're saying, Meng Jin. You're talking about the new wave of immigrant novel that's looking at look at the life they left behind rather than focusing what it takes to become fully American. And you went somewhere in your answer just there that caught me by surprise. Because as a reader, I mean, you're totally spot on, and I get what you're saying. As a reader, I was focused on what the next generation, in each of the 3 novels I mentioned, yours, The 10th Muse, Lisa Coe's The Leavers, about the young person who grew up here also feeling like a part is left behind, and that who they are has to do with where they came from. And so they make journeys to Germany and to China in these various books to try to piece together puzzles that weren't told. The pieces weren't revealed to them before, and they seem to feel that's an important part of who they are.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that for people who are displaced and, get born into contexts in which their lives are defined by displacement, there's always this uneasiness about who you are, who you're supposed to be when you look one way and maybe everyone else looks differently, or if even there's a part of you that you're told is a big and important part of you, like for example, my character is told that she's Chinese, but she doesn't know anything about China, right? Because she spent her entire life in the U.S. And in Catherine Chung's novel, 10th Muse, she learns that she knows that she's had this gift for mathematics, but she doesn't know where it comes from.
And as a Jewish reader, I was blown away at the turn that one took.
Right, exactly. So I think that as the world becomes more globalized and there are more people whose lives are defined by migration and displacement, there are going to be more of these stories about trying to understand, the histories and lineages that make up a person.
That's so interesting. And then, so it's important to me, Meng Jin, you have a new book, Little Gods, that I recommend everybody read. So I don't want to give away the plot. I want to talk to you about a conclusion you make at the end. And I'm wondering if we could talk about if you think it'll give away the plot. I don't want to say what happens at the end when the daughter tries to find out the answers about her parents. I don't want to say what she concludes.
I think it's fine.
Okay, here's what I wanted to ask you then. I really worked on this so it wouldn't give away, because when I read a book, I don't want to know what happens. But you write at the end, you talk about how sometimes people conclude that it's okay to invent part of your story. That if you say, if you try to piece together where you come from, because we all have stories, and it's not just about immigrants, although immigrants are important factors in my family story. Even people who aren't immigrants, when you're trying to find out the secrets of your parents' past or who you are, you hear stories, and they may or may not be true. Then you find out stuff as you get older. You go on journeys to find out more about it. And then sometimes you don't get all the answers. Or sometimes you decide to stop looking for part of the answers. And one thing you say in your book is that sometimes you'll decide to tell your stuff, part of the story, over and over again that might not be true. And am I reading this wrong? But that when people ask you, it's kind of a good answer to give them, and they'll be satisfied with that. And that sometimes you tell yourself part of that story too, so that you'll be satisfied with that. Did I miss that? Did I get it wrong? I went back and looked at the end to see if that's where you were going.
That's the perfect reading. That was the reading I intended.
Okay. And, that's not usually what you find on these journey books. I mean, that's not at all a sum total of what happens at the end of yours. So there's definitely a lot you'll find out if you read this book, Little Gods. But you challenged me on that one. You challenged me about whether life can have neat endings or whether journeys of self-discovery can have neat endings. But
I mean, I definitely was very interested in exploring, the stories that people tell themselves to make sense of who they are, right? And I think that every story you tell, whether the materials are made of facts or embellishments, every story is an invention in some form,
including of nations.
You were talking earlier.
What we tell ourselves including as nations, what we tell ourselves of how we came to be the nation we are.
Oh my God, certainly, America has a lot of stories about its own, about its own origins that are partially invented. And so does China, and so does, every nation.
Well, we're running out of time here, but I did want to talk about linear versus nonlinear structure. So, like a lot of
sorry,
terrific...
you cut out for a bit. What did you say?
We only have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to get to the point about linear versus nonlinear structure. So, Little Gods does not start at the beginning and end at the end. It does start.
Yes.
It tells a story through a bunch of people's different eyes, and it's sometimes it goes back in time, then it goes ahead in time and back again. And one of the arguments I think you make in the book, and again, tell me if I was wrong about this, is that time isn't linear either. That's sort of the science part, right? And it's a little beyond my pay grade. But, the main character, Sulan, is a brilliant scientist. And one of the questions she's wrestling with in her life is how to understand time and whether it's linear or not. And how did you wrestle with that as a writer? How did that affect the way you wrote Little Gods?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that time as linear is like another story, right, that we can tell about time. In terms of starting at the beginning or starting at the end and ending at the beginning, I think that in real life we don't have neat beginnings and ends, like you mentioned earlier. It's only really when a storyteller comes along and has to figure out where to start the story that the need for a beginning arises. Right? Even when you think about the ultimate beginning, like the birth of a child, which is how my book begins,
it's quite a scene.
Every child comes into the world with so much history, every child comes into the world in a time and place that's so laden with meaning. The only event I can really think of that is a true beginning is the Big Bang, but we don't really know very much about the Big Bang.
And even to understand the Big Bang, we imposed this linear idea of time on it. But in any case, Bob McCormack is listening to the show, and he has a question for you. Do you think Asian Americans Asians will get the credit they deserve in Hollywood? So there was one nomination for one movie involving Koreans, not the same thing, but what's your sense on that? That came out of another position. Thank you, Bob, for that question.
I certainly hope so. I mean, I think one of my favorite films of the last year was The Farewell. I'm excited. Parasite. I haven't seen it yet.
Right, I haven't seen Parasite either, but I definitely want to go see it. So let's bring it back to Little Gods. Has Hollywood yet come to talk to you about making a movie out of this?
No, but if anyone wants to, I'm here.
All right. Her name is Meng Jin. Her new book is Little Gods, and what a great book it is. I recommend it to you. Very exciting. The new wave of fiction about immigrant stories, Chinese and Chinese-American immigrant stories. I highly recommend it. Meng Jin, thanks for visiting with us on Dateline New Haven.
All right. Thank you so much.
And folks, hold tight. We got this is just part one of Dateline New Haven today. We have a great bunch of guests coming on next with a program called Imani. And, we're just going to take a little 5-minute break where you can listen to the Afro-Semitic experience and then come back to talk about substance abuse and one faith-based approach to dealing with the substance abuse crisis, opioids, and other drugs that's working right here in New Haven at the grassroots and is being taken on the road. So hold tight. The Afro-Semitic experience performing I Wish I Knew How I Feel to Be Free. And we'll be right back here on Dateline New Haven.